Let's talk about planning for LID. This is Chapter 2. So in Chapter 2 we have a bit of an introduction. We talk about LID planning principles. We run through the LID site analysis process, and we actually describe LID site mapping. So key LID planning principles. And again, LID is about mimicking Mother Nature to the extent possible and managing storm drainage as close to where it falls as possible. So in order to do that, what we look to do is preserve native vegetation, protect critical areas, minimize impervious surfaces, minimize grading and compaction of site soils. We attempt to identify and preserve existing storm drainage flow paths. We attempt to disperse stormwater to vegetated areas. And we try to utilize naturalistic surface conveyance facilities rather than piped conveyance. And we utilize small-scale distributed LID technologies. We want to try to identify and map prominent features on a site. For example, if there are rivers or streams or creeks or lakes, those would be identified, characterized, buffers would be defined. We'd also identify minor features like seeps and springs or other general drainage swales that would occur across the site. We would identify surface flow patterns, discharge locations, subbasins, flow durations, erosion, deposition patterns. The picture on the left is of an LID project that was actually designed a number of years ago. The developer and the engineer had the luxury of actually studying and characterizing that site for about a year before permits were submitted. In that particular case, there was a whole series of instrumentation that was put on the site to really study not only surface flows, inner flows, deep flows of water, storm drainage coming from off-site on the site, and just general flow patterns. So that's sort of an extreme example of hydrologic characterization. Hydrologic patterns and features, we tend to want to think about subbasin delineation. The advantages of detailed delineation, what we're trying to do is look to achieve distributed practices that can reduce hydraulic and pollutant loads. We try to identify a distribution of smaller scale BMPs to better interact with other design elements. We have tools now that allow sizing that can accurately account for tributary drainage and required sizes of individual BMPs. The old hydrologic models were very general in character, and now some of the new models we have allow us to really fine grain the sizing of individual BMPs. And by doing that, we have a more accurate understanding of the cumulative LID site performance. So the slide on the right characterizes several things: a distribution of LID BMPs, and then this concept of breaking that small site into subbasins, where each one of those subbasins is considered sort of separately in terms of how storm drainage is managed. Hydrologic patterns and features identify, protect, and restore. We have critical areas. Some people suggest that in eastern Washington we don't have wetlands, right? But we do. We have wetlands, obviously. We have streams. We have riparian areas. We have an incredible riparian area that flows through Spokane, for example, the Spokane River. Flood plains and other water bodies. All these features need to be identified, delineated, characterized, and the appropriate buffers established. And I know Ecology has been working over the last several years to working with jurisdictions through their grant programs to update those critical area ordinances with the best available science that we have today. Okay, the next general category is soil and subsurface hydrology. We want to identify infiltrating soils. In some areas, for example, around the Tri-Cities, infiltration is not really an issue. We know we have terrifically infiltratable soils. There are perhaps pockets and places where we have clay layers or restricted soil layers, but generally, for example, in the Tri-Cities, that area is characterized by highly infiltratable soils, whereas in Spokane, we have quite a diverse profile of soil conditions. So we have soils that infiltrate very, very well, and others that really are cemented and don't allow for infiltration. So we want to identify those less pervious soils, and that's critical in the selection of BMPs, if you will. That can be an feasibility criteria for certain BMPs. We want to identify depth of groundwater. Obviously, there needs to be a separation between the bottom of a structural BMP and groundwater at the surface. We want to identify the presence of shallow bedrock. And if at all possible, we want to do small-scale pilot infiltration testing just so we can confirm the infiltration capabilities of sites, particularly large sites. We want to do a soil grain size analysis and the other option is large-scale pilot infiltration test. And I believe that Robin, as we get into the sizing exercise, will provide a little more information on some of this detail, some of these concepts. So native vegetation and soil protection areas, a basic inventory. We want to identify vegetation on the site and identify species and conditions of ground cover and shrub layer. Also condition of the trees themselves. We know we can have forests that have disease problems, and those areas should be identified. An important aspect of vegetation inventory is not only the trees themselves, but the understory. We know that trees, particularly evergreen trees, and the good news is provide the highest level of storm drainage attenuation. And so particularly if we have evergreen trees with an understory, and the understory can be syringa, it can be those shrub communities that characterize eastern Washington. We're not talking about rich rainforest. Just an understory technology or an understory characterization is really important, and to the extent that we can preserve those areas, we want to try to do that. In Spokane, for example, there is recently a recognition of the value of ponderosa pine across our community, and I think even the city of Spokane has done some modeling in terms of storm drainage patterns across the city. For example, the South Hill, which is characterized by an incredibly rich urban forest and also a very healthy ponderosa pine forest in that neighborhood. The storm drainage characteristics of that South Hill is quite different than what we might see, for example, in Hilliard or the far reaches of North Spokane, if you're familiar with North Spokane. It's not devoid of trees, but the urban forest is quite different on the north side than on the south side. So identifying underlying soils using soil test pits and soil grain analysis to assess, again, infiltration capacity, particularly in those areas where we might look to disperse storm drainage. So on the kind of non-engineered side, these are also important factors. Access. Identifying access requirements on a project. Are there single or multiple access points required? Emergency vehicle access, very, very important. Conceptual and roadway and parking layout would be something that would be addressed at a conceptual level in the site analysis. Roadway widths. Of course, one of the basic principles of LID is the reducing impervious surfaces. Some communities have actually chosen to have applied strategy to significantly reduce the width of roadways. So we need to balance things like emergency vehicle access, snow removal in eastern Washington with that goal of trying to reduce roadway widths where possible. And there are some strategies that can be employed to accomplish that pretty effectively. We look at parking standards. One of the things that we try to encourage communities to do related to parking is think in terms of maximum parking count. In other words, no more than so many stalls. Emphasizing things like compact car stalls in larger parking lots, identifying those areas and encourage the identification of compact stalls in parking lots. And then perimeter and internal landscape requirements, very, very important. Most communities do allow the landscape standards that might be applied, for example, in parking lots to also count for required landscaping, and that's something that we would try to encourage. Another concept that we would encourage you to consider When I was a young landscape architect doing site designs for commercial projects, everybody had to have a berm. All planting areas had to be bermed. And we did that to attenuate the visual impact of large parking lots. You know, if we create a berm, then we can't see the cars. Well, that visual attenuation can occur with plant material. And so what we try to encourage people to look at is just the opposite, more of a concave layout of those internal parking lot and allow them to become actually storm drainage management areas. So that's something that can be accomplished in your landscape codes. Another key thing about landscape, when we talk about landscape codes, oftentimes we focus on what plant material, how much, and what is the spacing requirement for the plant material. And we have less emphasis on things like the soil structure. And so that's very important, obviously for storm drainage management, obviously for the health of the plant, but also storm drainage management. So those are all elements that we need to think about incorporating, including in our landscape codes, more flexibility for the designer to combine landscape with storm drainage management and more innovative ways to encourage a deeper, better, healthier soil profile, not only for plant health, but also for storm drainage. Utility availability and conflicts. Identify above and below ground utilities early in the design process. I mean, this obviously is, to engineers, is very, very basic, but map utility easements, note restrictions, identify utilities that may need to be moved, identify measures to protect those utilities. An example, there is a large bioretention project occurring in North Spokane on the Country Homes Boulevard project. That project will require, or will include, a fairly large squash pipe at the bottom of that swale. And so that is a boulevard that is traveling through a nicely wooded, beautiful neighborhood, Country Homes Boulevard. And so what we want to do is make sure, and of course there's a desire for trees, so we need to be very careful about where we propose to plant those trees so that any existing utilities, storm pipes coming in or that squash pipe that's below, won't be compromised by, for example, large trees that might be selected. So when we think of underground utilities or overhead utilities, oftentimes landscape architects talk about the right tree in the right place. So what we'll want to do is make sure that we're locating the trees properly and we're selecting the right tree for that location in terms of its size. Land use control, some very important things. Determine the comprehensive plan designation and then the zoning. Parking requirements, landscape requirements, is clustering of housing, for example, permitted. Some jurisdictions, City of Spokane would be one, actually has a design review process. And in their design review process, if you were to read the City of Spokane design review guidelines, they encourage low impact development technology. It's fantastic. This is great. And so what you want to do is, if you're a designer, you want to kind of take a look at that. If you're another jurisdiction, take a look at that as a great example. If you're a designer, I would use that as an argument with my clients to encourage them to incorporate more LID technologies in their projects. Can storm drainage and landscape be combined? We've kind of addressed that. Identify overlaid districts. Is design review required or is it optional? And what is the shoreline designation? We'll be, in the afternoon exercise, we've selected a site that has a lot of this. It's a shoreline location, so there's a shoreline jurisdiction. There is a buffer required. And so a lot of what we just presented in that slide is sort of characterized by the existing development. All of that taken together, what we want to do is prepare this composite map. Ian McCarg used to call this sieve mapping, where you take environmental values. Ian McCarg is an old landscape architect planner. He wasn't the first to do sieve mapping, but he popularized it. He was sort of like a minister who was, his sermon was sieve mapping and the environmental review process, and taking a look at the overlay of those values and defining the best areas for the most suitable areas for development, those areas that should be preserved. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about this composite site process is coming up with, taking a look at all of those values, the regulatory values, hydrology, topography, vegetation, soils, access, utility availability, or the existence of utilities, and identifying areas on a site where that are sensitive and should be preserved, or native vegetation that should be preserved, or areas where that are buildable, those areas that are more suitable for development. I apologize, this is this is an oversimplification of the concept, but basically that's what we're talking about when we talk about this composite site map. You're going to be doing some of this in the exercise this afternoon. The question is, does the manual just cover new development, or would it also cover retrofits or redevelopment projects? And the good news is the answer is yes. The manual is I think, is broad in that perspective. I can't say that it's just for new projects. It's for new projects. It provides great information for retrofits or modifications. It provides, and it also provides great guidance if, I like to talk in terms of, we want to encourage LID technology. Is a project that only includes one technology, let's say bioretention or pervious pavement, is that an LID project? Perhaps not, but the fact that they've chosen to apply the technology, that's a great choice. So the manual covers all of that. It covers new projects regardless of scale. It could be a very, very large project or a very small project. Certainly retrofits, the exercise we're going to go through today, is for a retrofit of an existing smaller parking lot and then an adjacent building. Or if you're simply interested in, let's say you're a homeowner and you'd like to install a bioretention area, sometimes, since they're not engineered, we call them, they're referred to as rain gardens. That information is available in the manual to help with selection and the design of that. The question is, how do you determine optimal locations for site improvements or BMP technology based on the site analysis and the plan? And I'd like to describe that as really an iterative process. We're going to kind of get into that in a little more detail as we get into Chapter 3. But it's an iterative process where you do the basic site analysis. And the site analysis for LID, I'll acknowledge, should be rigorous. For example, we would no longer simply go to a soils map or book and do a general characterization of soils. We'd want to do a much more detailed analysis. We want to identify not only where do we have infiltratable soils, but what is the infiltration rate? And so that really requires a higher level of knowledge. So the site analysis process is particularly related to soils, and hydrology is a little more rigorous, a little more detailed. But once we have that distribution of information, that basic information, and then we begin to apply the site program or our client's program. It might be a park department, it might be a city building a building, it might be a private client doing a plat, or it might be an industrial project or a commercial project. We take that program, in other words, I need a building of this size, I need this much parking, I know my access points have to be at these locations. Access, for example, is very critical. We have issues like site distance and clear view triangles. Fire department will want, it will have a specification for the type of access that they require. All of that information taken together and mapped begins to build a picture of where the most suitable areas on a site are developed or are available for development. That information kind of always in the back of our mind is, what technologies, what specific LID technologies do we think are feasible on this project? I always have in my mind, everything's feasible until I'm proven that it's not, until proven it's not. So what technologies are feasible? What technologies with a client, whether it's the city, the county, a private client, a developer, what will they be willing to accept and apply to the development? And so it's where we marry that site program and then the specific storm drainage goals and a picture begins to emerge of what's feasible, what's possible, and what those dimensions might look like. And then we get into Robin's sizing exercise where we actually test, okay, what must they look like in order to respond to the storm drainage requirements that we'll have to meet on that site.